So I recently got the privilege of attending a tasting of 30 of South Africa's most lauded red Bordeaux blends. It was a sort of peer review tasting where many of the people on the panel were in fact the winemakers of the wines that were present. The venue for the tasting was the incredibly beautiful cellar of Tybosch. Now Tybosch is the new name under which Cordoba wines are being made. So if any of you cult classic hunters were wondering what on earth happened to the Cordoba crescendo, well, now you know it is the Tybosch crescendo. Tybosch is now co-owned between the Otto family from France and Skulk Willem-Joubert, who was the CEO for Rupert and Rothschild wine for 20 years, a super experienced winemaker and all-round wine brain that is worth tapping into if you get the opportunity. Now, on the table, there were 30 wines from 7 regions across the Cape Winelands. When it came to vintages, we had 2018 being the youngest vintage and the oldest vintage going back to 2014. Now, while price is not an indicator of quality, it is interesting to note anyway. The cheapest wine was 170 Rand, which was the Demersdale Private Collection blend, and this was contrasted with the MR Compostela, which is at 1,650 Rand. Which brings the average price per bottle of the wine in this range to just over 600 Rand per bottle. Now, all the wines were tasted blind by a panel made up of many winemakers whose wines were on the table. Each panelist was asked to score the wine out of 100 points. But it needs to be said that dishing out points was not the goal of the exercise. That said, it's still quite interesting to have a look at these points. Now, the winning wine scored an average of 96 points across all tasters and came in at 1,500 Rand per bottle, while the fourth placed wine scored just 2 points lower and carried in a retail price of 350 Rand. As I said earlier, the 100-point score was not the point of the exercise, but for consumers looking to get a grip on value, it's really interesting to see the sorts of wines that winemakers score highly. Another interesting point to note here is that almost all of the wines in this 30 don't enter competitions, which means this was a rare snapshot into kind of a peer review situation where the industry is talking back to itself about some of its most lauded wines. If you want to get the lowdown and have me name names on who came where in the top 30, I will do so at the end of this video, but you're going to have to be patient. But forget about the points for now, because I think there are some far more interesting observations that I picked up just by sitting and listening to some of our finest winemakers debate with each other over a glass of wine. The first topic to raise its head was the drink now versus drink later debate. Now, honestly, at this point, it should be pretty obvious that fine wine is not winning any awards in the customer convenience department. For many wines on the table, there was a high level of disagreement as to when they would be ready to drink. Some winemakers were willing to offer a sort of 5-year window of max profit, in which they recommended their wines be drunk. But it should be noted that very few of these 5-year windows actually coincided with the release date of the wines. Put another way, many of our premium Bordeaux blends that go on sale in specialist wine stores are in fact not at all ready to be drunk, or at least the winemakers seem to imply that. And yet there's nothing on the bottle in order to explain to a less seasoned consumer that they might have to wait. And you might say, well, I don't care because I'm not buying expensive wines that I need to wait 5 years to drink. But you will have experienced this frustration every time you buy one of those ripen at home Avo packs, right? Do they ever ripen at home? No. They somehow manage to shrivel and remain rock hard all at the same time. Infuriating. Anyway, back to wine. One could argue that if this mystery time gap between buying a bottle of wine and being able to enjoy the bottle of wine at its best was consistent, then it would be simply a case of getting to know the industry. But it isn't so. The end result is that unless you're an absolute wine nut who can measure the oxygen particles per million in the headspace and the neck of a bottle, the chances of you drinking a wine in its maximum profit window is pretty slim. In fact, I've asked winemakers and wine critics to comment on the same bottle of wine and can't get them to agree. So what chance does the average wine lover have? There are estates who are cellar aging some of their most prized bottles, which means that by the time they're on the shelf, they are ready to be drunk. And I think this is a step forward, but you have to understand for a wine estate just how tricky this is. What you're doing is taking an already lengthy cash cycle of say 18 to 24 months and now turning it into a 4-year or 5-year cash cycle before you get any of your investment back. That's long. So I don't have any immediate solutions, and I acknowledge that this is a super tricky scenario. But I do feel like premium wine producers need to put on their thinking caps and tackle this problem with a little more vigor to ensure that passionate wine lovers who are willing to upgrade and buy flagship wines are given a slightly more concrete guarantee that they will get the value that they pay for. Observation number 2 from the conversation was that a great vintage is not a great vintage until it's in the bottle. There's that annoying old adage that a bottle of wine is really just an indication of how well you farmed your grapes. I.e., if the weather and climate and terroir have given you a fantastic vintage, you will have a fantastic wine. I don't think this is the case. In fact, listening to these winemakers wrestle with what seem to be perfect vintages, it's clear that actually being given a perfect vintage in the vineyard is a little like having Sachin Tendulkar on 99 in a test match. It's really a horrible place to lose from. So what am I trying to say? Well, I guess in short, what I'm saying is that even the greatest winemakers can get psyched out. One winemaker expressed how when you've had an absolutely perfect vintage of long, cool ripening periods, you feel like, let's let the fruit just hang a little bit longer. We can give it another few days. And then you end up harvesting slightly too late. But that isn't the end of the journey. Once the fruit is in the cellar, the thought pops up in the winemaker's brain. This is such high quality fruit. The concentration is so great. The balance is all there. We can definitely use a little more oak on this one. And so the end of all these little moments of doubt, whether it's harvest date or number of punch downs or use of oak, is that you have a wine that is potentially a little too extracted, a little too oaked, and a little too big in what was supposed to be the perfect vintage. So it really was interesting to hear winemakers assessing their own wines and going, this was such a great year. Wouldn't it have been amazing if we just stepped back a little bit? I thought it was a really interesting point for them to outline that a great vintage does not guarantee a great wine. The argument that followed all this was that in a lesser vintage where perhaps weather was a little more problematic, you might have harvested a little bit earlier because you were forced to by weather patterns. And the end result is you actually end up with a more honest wine because you harvested at a slightly lower ripening level. My third takeaway from this conversation was that typicity is important. Now, for those of you who might not have heard the term, typicity is the idea that a certain grape or a certain blend of grapes from a certain region should have a very recognizable group of flavor notes. In other words, they should possess predetermined and broadly agreed upon characteristics. For example, one might hold the idea that a Cabernet Sauvignon from Stellenbosch should have a mix of cassis and some black cherry, as well as complications of cigar box, pencil shavings, tobacco, and, depending on your preference, a level of both herbal notes and herbaceous notes. This is what typicity means for a Stellenbosch Cabernet. Now, this idea has application when you drink a Stellenbosch Cabernet Sauvignon that is absolutely delicious as far as you're concerned, and it has lovely notes of plum and smoky bacon and raspberry. It may be delicious, but it doesn't have typicity for what is largely agreed upon as a Stellenbosch Cabernet. Now, in this particular tasting, there was one wine that was really enjoyed by half the panel. They thought it was interesting and offbeat, but even though half the panel enjoyed the wine, 100% of the panel agreed that it should never ever be entered into a Bordeaux blend competition because it would do terribly. So again, for consumers who may not be used to this sort of thinking, typicity is really important to define what one might be able to expect from a certain blend of grapes in a certain region. Now, while the idea may seem more contradictory than a Christopher Nolan film involving time travel, the thought is that if you are strict about typicity, if you can clearly define what a certain grape in a certain region should taste like, then all that predetermining and boxing in actually preserves a broad range of diversity that you can find from wines around the world, because the differences between each region are very distinct. So if I were to sum it up, the thesis goes that if we can narrow variability within a certain region, we preserve diversity in a much broader context. My fourth takeaway from the day is that Charles Hopkins is a boss. Now, the De Grendel Rubaiyat 2016 was the Thai top scorer of the evening. In fact, it was also my top scoring wine. When one adds to this fact that his Optiberg Pinot Noir, his Optiberg Chardonnay, his Optiberg Syrah, newly released, as well as things like his Elim Syrah, are cleaning up year after year at some of our top wine awards around the country. And we include the fact that he is probably the foremost authority on Sauvignon Blanc, perhaps alongside someone like David Nievoet or even Duncan Savage, but he is really right up there as just this rich body of knowledge, specifically on Sauvignon Blanc. You have to ask, why is he not Mr. Wine in South Africa right now? It's hard not to agree that Charles Hopkins is one of the most valuable intellectual assets in South African wine today. Takeaway number 5 is a little more philosophical. As South Africans, we live in a culture where we favor entrepreneurs and mavericks and young guns and rule breakers and disruptors, because that's kind of the society we live in. We're the new world. We think out the box. And in fact, we often look at the old world and pity them for the way they are shackled to their traditions and unable to break the constraints of the past. But when I was sitting listening to winemakers from a number of different generations talk amongst themselves, it became very obvious to me that we have a little bit of the old world here with us in South Africa, in the form of people like Charles Back or Charles Hopkins or Schalk Willem Joubert. Now, it's fair to say we have programs like the Cape Winemakers Guild Protégé, where students coming straight out of winemaking college are put in a study, tutor, mentor type situation under some of the greatest winemakers in the country. And that's fantastic. But I think there's this middle band of winemakers who've perhaps been in the industry for 10 years or 15 years who really still need to be able to bounce ideas and ask questions from winemakers, men and women, 20 or 30 years their senior. And this is a gap that I would love to see filled by the sort of platforms that I saw unfold, where someone like Charles Hopkins could talk to younger winemakers and give them advice based not on a textbook or a trend, but just 20 or 30 years of vintage after vintage experience. The small little things, the little details that you really only learn with years and years on the job. Wouldn't it be great if some of our middle-aged winemakers were able to still glean these valuable insights from guys who have gone on ahead of them? Okay, enough philosophizing. I promised you that I would name names. So what I'll do first is give you the top 3 as far as the entire panel was concerned. So the top 3 wines, all with an average score of 96 points, were the Buchenholzkloof Journeyman 2015, the De Grendel Roubaix 2016, and the Thelema Rabelais 2017. As for my personal favorites, the top 2 echoed that of the rest of the panel, but I had 3 wines that were tied third that were not necessarily at the top of the panel's list. They were Babylon Stern's Nebuchadnezzar 2018, Kaapstad Pentagon 2017, and the Warwick Trilogy 2017. And then we must talk about best value. Although it needs to be said, when you're looking at a lineup of wines where the average price is over 600 Rand per bottle, value doesn't really come into it. I mean, once you pass that 400 Rand mark, really, you're selling brand more than you're selling wine. So, whether it's Rand to Reward or Dollar to Delight or Quality to Kwacha if you're Zambian, here are the wines that featured most prominently. The wine that raised the most eyebrows in its ability to deliver pleasure for pennies was probably the Dimmersdal Private Collection Bordeaux blend, tied closely by the slightly more expensive but also higher scoring Tybrosh Crescendo 2018. Many of the conversations that were raised didn't have any immediate conclusions. Another one that was raised was, when we're talking about typicity, how can we do so when there's such a broad range of stylistic differences? We've got Cabernet Sauvignon led, Merlot led, Petit Verdot led, Cabernet Franc led. All of these wines are going to deliver vastly different qualities, not to mention the fact that South Africa has one of the most diverse winelands of anywhere in the world. So trying to figure out exactly what a South African Bordeaux blend should taste like is almost nonsensical, given that even within Stellenbosch, there was a vast array of different expressions of this particular category. So I'm sure there's plenty of controversy, plenty of food for thought. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave your comments below and subscribe to the channel, or just subscribe to my wine club and then you can drink all the stuff I find for you. Visit www.handdrinksolo.com.